Cécile Révauger. I'm emeritus professor at University of Bordeaux. And when I started working on Freemasonry, something like 40 years ago, with my first PhD on the Grand Lodge of England, I did not imagine that I would attend this event today. And I would really like to thank Professor Newman and Asquatio Coronati for really setting up this event. It's a major event. Now, Robert Frecker Gould had pointed at the lack of documented evidence for the period 1717-1723. Andrew Prescott and Susan Somers referred to the work of Bedgeman, also translated by Wibert, Early History and Beginnings of Freemasonry in England, which was totally bypassed because it came out at the wrong time, during World War I, when anti-German feelings were very strong and prevented Ars Quatuorco Naturum from publishing the German author. Andrew Prescott and Susan Somers have now proved, I think, that the Grand Lodge was not founded in 1717, contrary to what was asserted in the 1738 edition of Anderson's Constitutions, but in 1721. They rely on documented evidence, which you have heard, so I'm not going to repeat it. Stuxley Diary, and mostly the Minutes of Lodge Antiquity #1, and the personality of James Anderson. So what I'm really concerned about is how can one account for the fact that such obvious conclusions are only coming to the fore now? Well, I contend that nobody really cared about the exact date. Why? First, because the 1723 version of Anderson's Constitutions was considered as the Bible of British Freemasonry. In France, where even the 1723 version was often ignored, the 1738 version almost passed unnoticed. When Latierce eventually translated the text into French in 1742, he worked on the 1723 edition. Second, historians of Freemasonry were for a long time essentially concerned with the roots of 18th century Freemasonry. Was there a strong link between the so-called operative Masonry of the preceding centuries and Grand Lodge Freemasonry in the 18th century? So the roots were what mattered. Third, especially in France, several historians romanticized Jacobite history, focusing on the hypothetic Lodge of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, totally underplaying the fact that the Jacobites supported divine right monarchy and Catholicism rather than parliamentary democracy and religious tolerance. That is to say, the values of the Enlightenment. In France and elsewhere, several historians of Freemasonry preferred to insist on the continuity between the 17th and 18th centuries rather than focusing on the birth of a new type of Freemasonry, Grand Lodge Freemasonry. Also significant of the wish to minimize the birth of the Grand Lodge of England was the fact that it was referred to as the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, even a long time after it had become known as the Grand Lodge of England. So should one consider Prescott's and Somers' discoveries as revisionist? Do their findings actually change the significance of the birth of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, the ancestor of the Grand Lodge of England? I contend that this is not the case. Their scientific findings are essential to establish facts and replace myth and legends with history. However, they do not change the profound meaning of the birth of modern Freemasonry. Whether in 1717 or in 1721, the emergence of the Grand Lodge was a major political event indebted to the Enlightenment. Without the 1688 Glorious Revolution and the 1689 Bill of Rights, such an event could not have taken place. As Berman clearly showed in his recent thesis and today, the founders of the Grand Lodge were either Anglicans or the sons of Huguenots, such as Desaguliers himself, or Charles Labelle, de la Faye, all staunch supporters of the Hanoverian dynasty and eager to promote the values of the Glorious Revolution, and to resist the Jacobites, who threatened to restore divine right monarchy. Anderson himself was eager to show his attachment to the Hanoverian dynasty, and Susan has often quoted the talk he gave at Aberdeen to congratulate George I on his victory over the Jacobites in 1715. I myself have repeatedly contended that the second article of the Constitutions had been very carefully worded by Anderson and his followers. Contrary to the Dumfries manuscript, which demanded that any Mason hearing about a plot should immediately report it to the king, Article 2 of Anderson's Constitutions did not even impose the eviction of a rebellious member. A lodge could not exclude one of its members simply for rebelling against the state if, I quote, convicted of no other crime, and providing the lodge did not, I quote, countenance his rebellion. Clearly, Anderson's Constitutions endorsed the Whig views of the time, which discarded the Tory theories of passive obedience and non-resistance. Indeed, John Locke had shown that the people was entitled to rebel against the king if the latter misbehaved. That is to say, if the king placed himself in a state of war against his people, thereby making himself guilty of a breach of contract. Anderson and his companions did not urge passive obedience from subjects and clearly endorsed Locke's view, taking care not to be associated to Tory theories. The values of the Enlightenment were embodied by the Hanoverian elites and not by the Jacobites, who supported the Stuarts and divine right monarchy. The Grand Lodge of England endorsed the values of the Enlightenment from the outset. And this is also true of John Locke's impact on the religious tenets which appear in Anderson's Constitutions. Those tenets are latitudinarian, that is to say, they give latitude of belief, right? And indeed, dissenters were accepted. All right, not anti-Trinitarians, but, in those days, anti-Trinitarian, it was just as bad to be an anti-Trinitarian as to be an atheist, right? So this is why Anderson clearly said that he was not an anti-Trinitarian. So to conclude, Susan Somers and Andrew Prescott's findings clearly show that the Grand Lodge of England was not born in 1717 but 4 years later. Well, that's what I think. And I support their view. That Anderson deliberately cheated on the date in 1738, probably because he was asked to do so by the Grand Lodge authorities. However, the difference in dates does not change the political meaning of the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England. Something did happen, whether in 1717 or 1721. Something happened, and it was a major event. On the one hand, the difference in dates does not change the political meaning, because on the one hand, in spite of the existence of Irish and Scottish lodges, the Grand Lodge of England could claim its premiership as an institution, and this was important. On the other hand, it brought its full support to the Hanoverian dynasty. So doing, the Grand Lodge embraced the values of the Enlightenment, parliamentary monarchy instead of divine right monarchy, religious tolerance instead of religious dogma, natural rights philosophy, John Locke's philosophy, rather than natural law, Robert Filmer's patriarcha. No wonder Pope Clement reacted so violently in 1738. Thank you.
Just before I start, since this became a live debate, how many of you have actually gone and read Anderson's Constitutions? Can I have a show of hands? Lovely. You may or may not learn something from this, but I decided to... I did come across one quote, and that is from Calvert in 1917, and he says, "It is necessary occasionally to take stock of our accumulation of data and rearrange the main points in the form of a concise narrative." Interesting, a century before, someone else had had the same idea, so it's not new. This is about reading Anderson. I got my white forensic suit out and the blue gloves, and I crawled through 3 or 4 pages of Anderson only. That's about all I'm going to talk. Just to see what was really there. To see, have we read what we wanted to read, or did we read what Anderson wrote? And I hear all these things, that he was a flawed character and so on, and I accept all of that. I accept other people would have influenced him. I accept all that. But I don't think Anderson would have got away with a complete fiction. So there's something in it somewhere, if we can but disentangle it. The only reference prior to events prior to 1721 is in Anderson's 1723 Constitutions, and it's that single thing on page 58 that the general regulations were prepared and were passed. We come on now to assembly and feast, because the Grand Lodge of England has always been about feasting in its way. And what did Anderson say in 1738 about 1717? He said they had an assembly and feast. And if we look at again on 1718, 1719 and 1720, he said exactly the same. He talks not one jot about a Grand Lodge or a quarterly communication. He only refers to the assembly and feast. No mention of anything else. And in 1721, again, the assembly and feast. But for all subsequent meetings, he refers to the Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge. So for Anderson, and presumably for the others who looked at it, there was some key point happening in 1721 that before, Anderson never refers to Grand Lodge, and afterwards he frequently refers to Grand Lodge when he does his historical chronology. So, we've just done that bit. So there was, of course, some quality control. Now we go back to 1717, this magical date, St. John's Day in 1717. So what does Anderson actually say? And that's just the key bit. They met at the said apple tree. Whether it was an apple tree or not, it probably doesn't matter. But interestingly, he does not give a date. And he goes on, they constituted themselves a Grand Lodge pro tempore in due form. Pro tempore means for the time being, and it's a very transient thing. But more to the point, that particular statement, and I left the bit which I should have left, cut it out, and it says, accordingly, on St. John's Day they met and had an assembly and feast. But the point is, the first event, they met at the apple tree, but when? And they convened a Grand Lodge, a temporary Grand Lodge, pro tempore, and then he says, accordingly, we had the feast. Does anyone really think that they dashed off, having had this Grand Lodge pro tempore, jumped in their carriages, raced down to the goose and gridiron, and had their assembly and feast? I think that seems likely. So we actually don't know when this Grand Lodge pro tempore was. Was it 1717 or was it 1716? We simply don't know. Pro tempore is actually in the General Regulations of 1721, and it's Rule 17. You can all go and read it. And just to prove that this pro tempore was frequently used, there we are. This is in 1736 in the minutes of Grand Lodge, and what does it say? It says John Ward, Deputy Grand Master, acting as Grand Master pro tempore, and below that is Brother Desigulier, acting as Deputy Grand Master pro tempore. So it was, you were put into the chair for the occasion, for the meeting, and that was it. I would put it to you that when Anderson was writing this, that's what he was writing. He was writing on the occasion of the day that the four lodges got together and they just had a Grand Master pro tempore. Sorry, a Grand Lodge pro tempore. That is the only mention of Grand Lodge. There isn't a mention of Grand Lodge in St John's Day, 1714, at all. And since Grand Master Montague, Anderson and the proceedings may be different, because Grand Lodge asked that Anderson would print the names in the New Book of Constitutions of all the Grand Masters that could be collected from the beginning of time, with a list of the names of all the Deputy Grand Masters, Wardens and Brethren. Quite simple, you would think. What does Anderson have to say about it? Well, Anderson says he was asked with the names of the Grand Masters was ancient and modern, and the names of stewards since Grand Master Montague. So again, Anderson, in his mind, is making some difference between the time before Montague and the time after Montague. Okay, it could all have been conspiracy, but what did Anderson deliver? Anderson delivered a list of Grand Masters or patrons of the Freemasons of England from the coming of the Anglo-Saxons, And the little bit here, it's Sayer Payne Desigulier, it's 1717 to 1720, and afterwards he lists the Grand Masters, starting with Montague. So that, if you like, is how Anderson has a certain consistency. Whether he's right or whether he's wrong, there is an element of consistency there. So really, that's the point that I wanted to make, to say that, please, when you go and read something, read it in detail. Read every word, read every comma, because the commas and so on, they all alter the sense of it. Now, interestingly, one thing that does come to me, if we say there's no evidence for what was something going on, particularly before 1721, I would suggest to you that there probably is, and it's the visit of Dr. Desigulier to Edinburgh in August 1721, because there, recorded by the clerk, Robert Allison, in the minute book of the Grand Lodge of Edinburgh, at Mary's Chapel, 24th of August 1721, known guy, known book, known date, and he says, the late General Master General of Masons' Lodges. Andrew's a bit scathing about that, but you have to remember that they didn't have a Grand Master or Grand Master of Masons in Scotland at all. They had no Grand Lodge, no concept of a Grand Lodge. But Anderson was there. He introduced themselves as having some, I'll put it, managerial role in something Masonic down in England. And for me, that's pretty good evidence that there was something going on prior to 1721. But perhaps we don't quite know what it was. So really, my key conclusion is that I can't throw everything of Anderson out as being unreliable, that there has to be an element of something in it that was reality. Otherwise, it would not have passed the muster of Montague and Desigulier. So, slightly fictional maybe, but not devoid of content. It seems to me that there is no evidence that there was a Grand Lodge in 1717. I go along with Andrew Prescott saying the likelihood for me is it became formal in 1721. For me, yes, for me it says that is interestingly, 1717 is perhaps a bit of a red herring. There were things in between for my money. Thank you.
The problem is, the further down the line you come, the more that you find that, oh gosh, somebody's already talked about that, but never mind. As all of the protagonists in this debate have rightly stated, I'm sorry, I should have said, I'm John Wade, Director of Ceremonies of Quatuor Coronati Lodge and the editor of AQC. As all the protagonists in this debate have rightly stated, it is essential that we look at all of the primary sources for the birth of what became the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. These sources can be listed, and I'm not going to bother going through the list because you've seen them all on the board. Andrew Prescott and Susan Summers have centred their argument on what they see as the unreliability of Anderson's 1738 constitutions, and indeed have gone so far as to regard much of what Anderson says as invention. John Hamill has made the point that since there were people around in 1738, such as George Payne and John Desaguliers, who had been involved in the early years of Grand Lodge, they would surely have questioned Anderson's account. Desaguliers was a very respected and well-known scholar and lecturer and fellow of the Royal Society, who surely would not have compromised his scholarship by accepting what is now being suggested as blatant lying. Another two pieces of evidence, the important of which seem to have been largely overlooked by our speakers so far, with the exception of Rick Berman, are provided by first a minute of Lodge Mary's Chapel No. 1 in Edinburgh, dated the 24th of August, 1721, and secondly, in a letter from the second Duke of Richmond to Martin Folkes, dated Kirk 1725. I know they've been mentioned, but I want to say some things about them. Now, this first slide shows you this minute from Edinburgh. I'll read it very quickly. The which day, Dr. John Theophilus Desaguliers, Fellow of the Royal Society and Chaplain in Ordinary to His Grace James, Duke of Chandois, late General Master General of the Mason Lodges in England, being in town and desirous of having a conference with the Deacon, Warden and Master Masons of Edinburgh, which was accordingly granted, and finding him duly qualified in all points of masonry, they received him as a brother into their society. Now, these minutes of August 1721 in Scotland make it quite clear that Dr. Desaguliers had been, and note the term late, Master General of the Mason Lodges in England. And this could only have been the case if the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster had been in existence before 1721, and that Desaguliers had been a Grand Master before 1720, which is what Anderson said. That is between 1719 and 1720. The other passage on this slide. Dear folks, as you say, our brethren will never be satisfied. How can fellows be such fools? Yet a positively negative I need not give, but I have to a great reward, you may say to the Dukes of Montague and Berceau, those who were my predecessors, to have my print done first, but after they had got theirs, the Duke of Wharton's and the three that go before them, viz. Anthony Sayer, George Payne, Dr. Desi, for which I insist upon theirs being done first. Then I will consent to your lending my picture, but positively not before those six are finished. Now, this letter from the Duke of Richmond to Martin Folkes again makes it abundantly clear that the list of the Duke's predecessors refers to them as Grand Masters. In addition, the minutes of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster throughout these early years, from June 1723, refer consistently to Anthony Sayer, George Payne and Dr. Desaguliers as, quote, late Grand Masters, which could not have been true unless the Grand Lodge had been founded in 1717, as Anderson states in his 1738 constitutions. Andrew Prescott and Susan Summers have maintained that Stukely's account of his initiation in January 1721, with its shortage of brethren to perform the ceremony, is at variance with Anderson's claim of noblemen joining the craft and an increase in the number of lodges. But John Hamill has pointed out that Stukely's account of his initiation in his diary was a straightforward statement of fact, and that the comment about the state of London masonry in his commonplace book came some 5 years later, at a time when he was clearly disenchanted with Freemasonry and other London societies. However, what neither side has commented on is that which is clearly to be seen from Stukely's diary entry for the 24th of June 1721. And I'll read this one. June the 24th, the Masons had a dinner at Stationers' Hall. Present, Duke of Montague, Lord Herbert, Lord Stanhope, Sir Andrew Fountain and Dr. Desaguliers pronounced a narration. The Grand Master, Mr. Payne, produced an old manuscript of the Constitutions which he got in the west of England, 500 years old. He read over a new set of articles to be observed. The Duke of Montagu chose Grand Master next year, Dr. Beale deputy. Now, there is no suggestion here of a new organisation being founded on that occasion, but rather of an annual event being repeated. It is no surprise that the press were interested because of the presence of a celebrated lecturer, Dr. Desaguliers, and several noblemen, including the Duke of Montagu. Now, my final point, which is not intended to contradict what I've put forward just now, comes as the result of a conversation that I had with Mark Dennis on his recent visit to a lecture in Sheffield. We should perhaps note that the terms Grand Master and Grand Lodge did not necessarily run in parallel. By this, I suggest that there was in 1717 a Grand Feast, revived from the operative Masons' traditions, latterly neglected by Sir Christopher Wren. This would no doubt have needed someone to preside over it, who could easily have been entitled Grand Master. Over the next 4 years, this could gradually have developed into an annual Grand Lodge as the body to hold the feast. Surely nobody would accept a fully fledged Grand Lodge suddenly appearing in 1717. It must, as other speakers have said, have developed gradually. But the presiding brothers at each annual feast could have been the succession of Grand Masters leading to the first nobleman Grand Master and the higher profile and publicity thus attracted. Thank you.
My name's Steve Smith. I presented a paper at the conference on Freemasonry, and it's printed in the transactions of that conference. And my comments, which I had thought I might have more than 10 minutes, but I don't, are based basically on the paper printed by Andrew and Susan that's printed in those transactions. So that's what I'm referring to. And my concern is mainly based on that some of the conclusions in that paper are based on opinion or speculation, not fact. An example of opinion being stated as fact but unsupported by any critical analysis or references is at page 700. The authors say, but what about Sayer, Lamble and their claims to have been the first Grand Officers in 1717? How did these stories arise? It seems that Sayer and others promoted these stories in order to help obtain charitable relief from Grand Lodge. Here the authors do not seek to refer back to earlier parts of the paper to support the facts that Sayer and Lamble made claims on Grand Lodge charity, which clearly they did, but it is clear that they were granted charity, so if they attained this because of what they claimed was their status as past Grand Officers, there is no evidence to suggest that Grand Lodge disputed this fact. In fact, the evidence that the authors present claim they did not. The use of the authors of the word stories suggests Sayer and Lamble were lying, but there is no evidence to support this contention. It is a matter of opinion of the authors, not a matter of fact. The authors have in fact presented evidence that would support what they term the stories were not made up by Sayer and Lamble, but failed to interpret this evidence on that basis. At page 689 of the paper, they refer to Grand Secretary John Reeves giving Anderson access to the minute books of Grand Lodge. And they say that at the end of the first minute book, we've already heard this, is a list of Grand Officers, beginning with Sayer as Grand Master and Lamble and Joseph Elliot as Wardens. The authors in this context are referring to the preparation by Anderson of the 1738 Constitutions, which lists the Grand Officers from 1717 onwards. They confirm that the list at the end of the minute book was not written by Anderson, albeit that he may have tinkered with some of the minor details. So it is clear that someone else who had access to the minute book understood that Sayer was the first Grand Master and wrote it down as an aid memoir for posterity. Sayer's petition for charity when he claimed he was the first Grand Master was in 1730. It is of course possible that the entry in the Grand Lodge Minute book was made following this, but either way someone or several people in Grand Lodge must have believed he was the Grand Master in 1717. This can be interpreted two ways. It is either true that Sayer was the Grand Master in 1717, or Sayer was a very good liar who was able to convince Grand Lodge of what was not true. On the balance of probability, it is likely that there were others in and around Grand Lodge that were aware of the events of 1717, and the other facts that the authors present, which are already known to Masonic historians, such as the newspaper account of Sayer's funeral in 1742, which speaks of the esteem in which he was held, support this. The authors of the paper seem to want this not to be true, so it supports their arguments. Therefore, they did not submit it to critical analysis. They compound this opinion unfounded in fact, by at the opening of a paragraph on page 703, saying, while Sayer clearly exploited his claim to be Grand Master for personal gain, and later on also saying, Sayer, Lamble and others concocted their stories about being first Grand Officers for personal gain and to enhance their prospects of charitable aid from Grand Lodge. This now leads us to suspect that there was a great conspiracy, someone else has already mentioned this, amongst many Freemasons at the time, which those in authority in Grand Lodge were unaware of or chose to ignore. The sort of language being used by the authors is simply a rhetorical device to convince the reader of their arguments. Sorry, I've got to cut out a lot of this because of time. So turning now to events closer to 1721, the authors quote from the diary and memoirs of William Stukely, who says it was difficult to find members enough to perform the ceremony when he was initiated in 1721. They conclude from this that it was impossible to reconcile this with Anderson's narrative, which declares that the number of lodges was at that time rapidly increasing. In 1723, the numbers of lodges listed by Anderson in the constitutions was 20, although it's not clear if these were all the lodges that existed or only those that assisted with the preparation of the constitutions. I suggest it was the latter. However, this represents a substantial increase over the 4 lodges referred to in 1717. The authors rely on Stukely's written account, but clearly not Anderson's. But might Stukely have misunderstood events, or might what he says be interpreted differently? After all, his account of finding insufficient members to perform the ceremony was written some 30 years later. He didn't say that this was the case in his diary at the time. Might his recollection some 30 years later be wrong? It could be interpreted that he was referring only to the lodge that met at the Salutation Savin, of which he had clearly been approved as a member before joining. If it doesn't refer to this, it is unlikely that he hawked around the idea that he wished to be introduced into Freemasonry and spent time searching for a lodge to join, or is it more likely he was introduced into the lodge by someone he knew? He clearly knew something about Freemasonry because it was his curiosity about it led him to be initiated into the mystery of Masonry. It is unlikely that he didn't know anybody that... Is it unlikely that he didn't know anybody that was a Freemason? The initiation ceremony, then as now, could only be performed by an installed master or past master. If the lodge at the Salutation Tavern was relatively new, it was unlikely to have had many, if any, past masters. If the master was not available, then a master from another lodge would have to be found to perform the ceremony. This still applies under the present Book of Constitutions. Only a master or a past master can perform the ceremonies. If the master is not available, this does not stop the lodge meeting because the wardens can run the meeting.
Stephen, the time has gone.
Time? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.